Hello, welcome to this first afternoon session on Transnational Philhellenism and the Mediterranean. Our speakers are all here, and we shall start with Lucien Frary, who teaches Russian, Balkan, and European history at Rider University, and his research deals with Mediterranean, Slavic, and Eastern Orthodox studies, in particular Russia's interest in the Near East, starting in the 16th century. You have the floor, please.
Ευχαριστώ. Υπάρχει PowerPoint. Μπροστά. Τέτοιο. Next. Εντάξει. Ευχαριστώ. Here we go. Terrific to see you all. Just a joy. Delighted to be here, and thank you so much for the organizing efforts and everything that goes into these complicated affairs. I was thinking about the best way to start, and I came up a little shallow, but let me share with you a line from the great novelist Boris Pasternak, who claimed that books were small, burning chunks of human consciousness. And for the next 20 minutes, I want to share with you a chunk of my burning consciousness. Because Roddy gives us 20 minutes, it took me months of time to read and think in my isolation, but here we go. The big topic concerns Philhellenism. And here we're looking at Russians involved in the Ionian Islands, starting really in the 18th century. And what I thought I would begin with is a note on archival sources. There are rich materials in Athens, but what I thought I would bring your attention to are the items in Russian archives which may interest you all. There are two principal locations. The Avpri, that you'll see there second as a bullet point, contains the foreign ministry records. And for us, that means consular reports, ambassadorial reports. To keep on time, I'll keep my clock nearby. Here we'll see really wonderful, mostly Greek observers of affairs in the Mediterranean for 3 centuries, reporting to St. Petersburg about what's going on. And this, of course, is just a wonderful window on our favorite topic. The other archive, which you may not be as much familiar with because it deals mostly with the earlier period, contains thousands of pages of Kapodistrias. You know, this person lived in Russia for a while, and he left drafts behind. So if you're interested in the early Greek state, this is a place to see. So the title of the paper is somewhat larger than just Russian Philhellenes and Ionian Russophiles, and what I attempt to do then is to bridge a gap in my own understanding about the evolution of Russian Mediterranean policy over the course of particularly the 18th and 19th century, and how this culminates in the efforts to support Greek independence. So what I look at then in this report, which I put together thanks to Roddy and Michali in the past few months, is Catherine's Mediterranean project. And before she assumes the throne in 1762, she's got a determination to establish a base in the Mediterranean, and she begins to engage spies, espionage experts, people who are orthodox and who are inclined to the Russian side of things. And at this time, there are many aristocrats in Russia who are interested in the ancient world, and they study Italian, and they begin to explore the Italian boot. Some of them are really expert artists, such as Karl Brюlov, but some of them become very close friends of the czars. And what I try to trace then in this report is the evolution of Russia's Mediterranean policy. So here, I'll say one or two things. We've got 20 minutes, but I'll leave Lenin off for the moment. So then the argument that I'm giving to you today is that the Russians arrive in the Ionian Islands and they politicize religion. they begin to experiment in new types of politics, including constitutions, as a way perhaps to fend off revolution. So it's searching for the juste milieu, you know, trying to find a way to stop the insurrectionists by giving them a bone and by experimenting in combined government. The second part of my argument is that the Russian presence in the Ionian Islands establishes the modern Greek military. And say what you will about arms and so on, the creation of a military is significant to any major state. And the narrative then begins with the first archipelago expedition, which is well studied. And as we know, the Baltic Fleet arrives in the Mediterranean and then eventually dominates the Aegean. But just as a bibliographic reference, let me put these two great books up on the screen there. Grebenshikova is the master of all things related to maritime affairs. It's the book on the left. It's 3 volumes, and it's just an imposing amount of research. And the one on the right is by Smilyanskaya et al. And again, this is the main work in Russian on the archipelago expedition. And here we've got Orlofika, we've got Russians engaging in different sorts of Greek military servitors, people who come on board ships. And it's a long story of different personalities, including, of course, Katsonis. We've learned of him before back in elementary school. And what the big shot is that here we've got the establishment of consulates. So when you've got these Russian agents who are really Greek on all the islands, and they begin to report, and they send their dispatches up to the north, and it's really an amazing thing to track how these people who the Russians employ describe their world, because are they Russian, are they Greek, are they Italian? Identities are in flux. The Russians might provide some assistance, and then all of a sudden Napoleon enters the scene. And I'm not an expert on anything, but let alone Napoleon, and his Balkan policy goes wrong. What is he doing in Egypt? I'm still trying to figure that out. But the Rosetta Stone gives us an answer, right? That's a good thing. But what this does is an incredible topsy-turvy in foreign policy, because suddenly the enemies of long time have become friends. So the Russians and the Ottomans close ties. And imagine that sort of connection. That's how bad Napoleon's policy really is. And we'll see then, because Tsar Paul doesn't like to participate in European affairs, that the entrance of the Russians into the Napoleon Wars is through the Bosporus. They enter from the Black Sea into what they call the White Sea in Ottoman language, and the admiral of the fleet is named Fyodor Ushakov. Ushakov Pasha, as we like to call him, travels to the Ionian Islands and establishes a base there because, of course, its geopolitical value. And what we'll see here is a combination, as Sakis Gekas knows very well, of local rebellions, different sorts of political games. And what's fascinating is that Ushakov is a pragmatic person, and he understands that the aristocracy is on the way out. That the commoners, the peasants, and the terminology that's employed in the Greek documents and the Russian documents is about the second class. So it's wonderful for the Soviet researchers to get into this, because it's all about, you know, the upheaval of the working class, and Ushakov is a liberator. So the result is that they begin to employ these Greek soldiers, right? Who some of them are exiled after Orlofika. They become refugees. They move their families onto the Ionian Islands, and they are palakaria who are looking for jobs. And they've got some skills, they've got some weapons, and the Russians say, come on board. So they begin then to work for the Russians, and then what my project turns to are the constitutional experiments in the islands for the next 7 or 8 years. A couple of things, and I know I'm short on time and all these sort of things, but Ushakov got canonized, as we'll see here on the slide, and that's a Chalenk, right? So this is the premier Ottoman award for military heroism, brilliance, and it's the only foreigner to get it. Ushakov. So what he does then is completes the conquest of the various islands, which are under control of the French. And there are stories to say about Zakynthos and all the other, Corfu or whatever island you wish to say. There are wonderful things. One thing that I really enjoyed about this project is suddenly to find these local historians who are the experts on these different islands. And then all of a sudden, new bibliographies emerge. But there's stories to say about numismata, about coinage and metals and all that sort of stuff. The Soviet Union establishes an award for Ushakov, and it's very prestigious today because it's still awarded for the #1 person in the Navy. Okay, and it goes back then to the 1940s, but Ushakov gets resurrected. And part of my point here is playing this Orthodox card, and that's something the Venetians, the French could not do. And obviously, my sources are tainted, but everyone loves the Russians. And a way of sort of understanding that is the establishment of new archbishoprics, right? So Ushakov has this idea that we must have independent church to go along the side of this. And we've been oppressed by the Venetian Catholics who have given us only a protopapas for the past 300-400 years. And now we've got independent people. And Ushakov is behind the election of these individuals, okay? And then eventually, I think there's still an archbishopric of Corfu, which is dated to Ushakov. For cinema fans, in the post-World War II era, the Soviets liked their war movies. It's part of the traumatization of going through all that violence. And everything is about fighting. But there's 2 pictures, you had to have a sequel. But the first is they're both in 1953, and this is about Ushakov, right? And this is about the first, or the second, actually, war against the Turks, right? And Catherine, that one's not as exciting. This one's super great. It's about the attack on Corfu, and it's got something for everyone. I mean, there's romance, there's excitement, there's battle scenes. One particularly interesting scene, a mildly inebriated Russian soldier, because the Greeks smuggled in a couple of grams of vodka, it wasn't the Russians, it was the Greeks who did that, ends up beating up a Turk for raping a Greek woman. So there's all kinds of symbols here, including the changing of alliances. How could we be paired up with Germany in 1941? But how could we be paired up with the Ottomans in the year 1798? So these fluid alliances and heroism at sea are part of the story here. And then there are other memorializations. And here we've got a shot of this stamp, which is, by the way, another sort of they're excellent, the practica, the conference proceedings. As I was studying the Ionian Islands in the past few months, there are 3 or 4 just really top-notch collections which come out of this. But here we go. There's a new cathedral constructed, and I'm way behind time, I know. But if I was going to be a patron saint, what would I want to be a patron saint of? And a nuclear-armed strategic bombers seems, you're not on call a lot. If you're patron saint of mothers or the harvest or something, you got to work all the time. But anyway, strategic bombers, you can take the next rest. So then the paper turns to, that's only like the first 4 or 5 pages, turns to the Septinsular Republic, Etanisos Politia, what a strange name, which is created, by the way, by the dragoman in Istanbul named Fonton, and he comes up with the name. Because the Turks, the Ottomans, I shouldn't say that, they say that they want nothing to do with Greek in the title of this new state. So then what my report turns to is prosopography. Have we heard of Capodistrias? I think we have. But we turn then to Mocenigo, and that was my partner for the past few months, and I learned as much as I could about Giorgio Mocenigo and his position there as more or less the commandant of the Ionian Islands. And he's a liberal thinker. I could tell you a long story about his family, and it represents also the sort of generational aspect of the Russian state employing Greeks, so that the fathers employ the sons and so on. So Mocenigo is this illustrious family in Venetian history. They were doges and et cetera, and he's a very well-read individual, and he ends up taking control of the islands. with Kapodistrias. And he has this, he's his mentor, as we know. And here are the names of some of the Russophiles, which are in my title. We know of Benaki, okay? And it was just terrific to learn about Liberakis Benaki, because he's a wild man stationed in Corfu for 30 years, writing reports to St. Petersburg. Dimitrios Naranzi, okay? And I've been following up on the Naranzis, and that's with a taf and a zita. Sometimes in Greek, you have to play around with the names, because they write in Italian and in whatever language they write in, and the names get changed. But it also is there like a Spanish word for an orange. So I always end up learning about. Anyway, Dimitrios Naranzi is the first ambassador from a Greek state to Russia since the fall of Constantinople. He gets stationed in Agia Petropoli and writes reports to Corfu. His older brother, Spiridon, is a Russophile and becomes a leader of the Senate in Corfu. Theotokis is an older individual at this time, but he's also very pro-Russophile. Kladas, Oreo, they go to Russia too and come and report. That's a picture of Theotokis over there. And then the various constitutional experiments then. So I'm going to zip through a bunch of stuff, and I'll wrap up and take you out of your misery in the next 3 minutes. So I know the time. Here are some of my friends for the past couple of weeks. And I'll tell you, walking around New Jersey in the middle of December with Ermanno Lunzi was amazing. Because Ermanno Lunzi took my breath away. I mean, to find this source. And then Mavroyiannis, Gerasimos Mavroyiannis. It's 2 volumes, Historia των Ionian Nison. And it's got a ton of detail. I used to think that Chiotis was the only guy who really wrote seriously in many volumes about the Ionian Islands, but there it is. This Theotokis volume, which is signed, by the way, if you see it up there. And then Koku, I always wanted to get into her works. It's a little bit textbook-ish, but she's a fantastic historian. And then Dinos, is it Konomos, I'm not quite sure, Konomos? But Dinos Konomos is the master of all things Zakyntheian. And he's a tremendously fluid writer who's interested in the Philiki, who's interested in Emboria, who's interested in everything. And he just writes really wonderful accounts. And then the other thing, this Lukatos, that's his dissertation, okay? It's 1959, something like this. It's extremely lucid. And he takes on what Kapodistrias does before he gets interested. You know, Kapodistrias is like 19. And suddenly he's the Secretary of State of the Ionian Islands. And there's this period of 6 years working under Mocenigo, which really changes his life. So a little bit of word, and I'm almost done. I'm going to take 2 minutes extra, Maurizio, okay? 2 minutes extra. Here we got a couple of shots of the Russian side of things with a couple of books in English. Norman Saul is currently the #1 expert, really, on the history of American-Russian relations. But his dissertation was on Russia and the Mediterranean. This book by Papas, some of you may know him. He's oftentimes active in Athens, but that's still a really solid work. Stanislavskaya is the main thing, the blue book on the right. And she became the expert in all things Mocenigo. And again, let me point out that because of the Soviet Union's sort of Marxist interpretation, it fit very well to take on Ushakov, because what he's trying to do is elevate the poor people into some sort of a political role against the aristocracy and the greedy people. And then, of course, our friend Grigory Arsh. And there's a picture of him, and thank you so much for all the work that Professor Diala has done to bring Arsh's work to our attention. But then a few more things. So that's like, I talk about politics and constitutions, and I got bored by constitutions. So the other part is military traditions. And that's supposed to be a picture of Ali Pasha. And as you know, he takes over all those areas on the Ionian coastline up through Ragusa. And it forces the Suliots and the Chimariots and all this up to the Ionian Islands. And they're unemployed. And they have these sort of military lifeways, where they like the blood feud, where you don't sleep far from your weapons, and where, to get a belt in public means you have to kill a wild boar or some sort of, ludicrous thing. So these people end up then being trained by the Russians, okay? And there's a very famous general named Emmanuel Papadopoulos, He is already engaged in Russian service starting in the 1770s, and he goes up through the ladders. Anybody who trains PhD people who are interested in this sort of stuff, I think Papadopoulos would make a wonderful topic. It brings together a lot of themes. But he publishes what I argue is like the first major military manual in Greek history, in modern Greek history. And I haven't seen it. It's 60 pages. I've found excerpts, especially in the Mavroyiannis thing, where he's got quotations. So I take it. But then I also found, I always wanted to study about Suli. So this paper, and I'm done. I'll give you 2 more minutes. I say 2 more minutes. So the Suliots are so crazy interesting. And Konstantinos Ravos is a person who really discovers them. And he's writing during World War I. For whatever reason, he might have been, pushed over in that direction. But he calls it here, the Russians, they are training our military. And that's the people, Kolokotronis, didn't we hear him today? I think we did. Oops. I'm the second one to do that too, so that's okay. So Kolokotronis comes and gets trained and then gets inspired. And you can go into the different sort of techniques that the Russians employ. But then anyway, Tilsit, the Russians are gone, and the Ionians continue in Russian service. So I could go through many different individuals. I'm particularly fond of Vlasopoulos, but these are the guys who keep writing the letters back to St. Petersburg, and there's much to say about each person. Mocenigo, my guy, his dad actually has a wonderful tomb in the Church of the Greeks in Venice, and his son then gets also put there after his death. And then Ushakov has got this memorial in Corfu, and we'll leave off on this. So what do I want to say to sort of wrap things up? My point is that here we go. Russia is a symbol of liberty, independence, freedom, glory, excellence. And they are going to bring us a better life. And it's a moment in history where Russia is really such a wonderful symbol. And it's sort of interesting to reflect on contemporary times. But there's more to add on a different date. So, ευχαριστώ για την προσοχή σας.
Thank you very much. And our second speaker is Maurizio Isabella, who is Professor of Modern History at Queen Mary University of London. He is the author of Risorgimento in Exile, co-author with Konstantina Zanu on Mediterranean diasporas, and Southern Europe in the Age of Revolutions. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much to the organizers of this conference. I'm really delighted to be in this panel with friends like Anna and Christina, and with somebody whose work I met, whose work I knew and admired, and I'm so happy I've just met, like Lucien. And so what I'm going to do today is to take as a starting point to think about Philhellenism and mobilities, Sicily. So what do the lives of a Cretan naval officer, an Irish general, and the Palermitan Carbonaro turned into a freedom fighter have in common? I take as a starting point the lives of these 3 individuals who were all involved in the revolution of Sicily in 1820-21, and whose destiny after that year took them in different places, to explore the ways in which mobilities and conflict interacted in the post-Napoleonic era across the Mediterranean. And why Sicily? Sicily is a kind of little-known revolutionary moment in the 1820s wave of revolutions. It is, in a way, a peculiar, an odd place not to rethink the age of revolution. But in July 1820, an insurrection of the capital of the island breaks out, an insurrection in which all classes of the population take part on the day of the of the celebration of the saint patron of Palermo, Santa Rosalia, there is a procession which coincides with an urban revolt that leads to the declaration of a provisional government run by the aristocrats of the island and the artisan corporations that declares the independence of Sicily against Naples and introduces a constitution, the Spanish Constitution, and opens up a debate about the future constitution of the island. So this is, it leads to a domino effect across the whole island with insurrections in all towns and cities that lead also to a civil war that divides the island into parts and opposes Palermo to Catania between 1820 and 1821. So why does a revolt break out in Palermo in coincidence with the celebration of the saint patron? Because just a few days before, a revolution is declared in Naples that introduces the Spanish Constitution and which follows up two other revolutions, the one in Spain and followed by the one in Portugal. And so Sicily, the revolution in Sicily is part of a domino effect that continues in these 2 years that also touches obviously Piedmont and the Ottoman Empire. And this is actually reflected in the way in which the Sicilians talk about their own revolution, shouting in the squares of Palermo and Messina, "Viva la Costituzione di Spagna." So they are well aware of what's happening in the Iberian Peninsula and follow it with great interest. So the aim of this talk is to use Sicily as a kind of vantage point to decenter European Philhellenism, to provide a different context, and also to show the coexistence of multiple trajectories and affiliations in the 1820s, and to rethink the ways in which one could become a revolutionary and even also a Philhellene. And so I will start with the first of these 3 biographies. And what is perhaps not well known is that the revolution in Palermo breaks out with an attack to the leader of the Neapolitan army there. And this leader is an Irish general called Richard Church, who's attacked in the Landau because he's accused of not supporting the independence of the island. He flees Sicily, goes to Naples, where he's arrested and kept in prison for the rest of the revolution. Why is Church attacked? Because he's seen as a symbol of Bourbon Neapolitan despotism. But also he's attacked for another reason. Why is an Irish general in Sicily in 1820? Because Church, who was the son of a tradesman from Cork, had been spending most of his adult life in the Mediterranean, training native populations, for instance, in Corsica, and then in Calabria, to fight in the Napoleonic Wars against the French army. He had spent a number of years in Sicily when Sicily was occupied by William Bentinck, and he had led an expedition from Sicily to Calabria to fight the French army and also to repress brigandage. He specialized in training local troops. He did it with the Corsicans, and then he moved on to train also Greek, as you mentioned, sort of Greek troops in the Ionian Islands, where he created sort of a regiment which included also Colocotrones. So he continued. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he doesn't go back to Britain, but he remains in the kingdom of the 2 Sicilies at the service of the restored Bourbon regime. He continues to train Greek troops for the king of the 2 Sicilies and to use them to repress brigandage, as he had already done during the Napoleonic Wars. He's involved in an expedition in Puglia where he persecutes groups of brigands led by a brigand called Anichiarico, who were involved in the Carboneria and the secret society in favor of the constitution. He executes more than 100 of them. So one of the reasons why he was so hated in Palermo in 1820 is because he's a symbol of Bourbon despotism, because he reminds Sicilians of the occupation, of British occupation, but also because he had persecuted brigands who were in favor of the constitution. In this period, is not just at the service of the Bourbons, but is also at the same time keeping in mind the interest of Great Britain, the imperial interest of Great Britain in the central Mediterranean. In 1815, he sends a memorandum to the Duke of Wellington, arguing that the Ionian Islands should become a British protectorate and they should be used to exert the influence of the British Empire across the eastern Mediterranean against Russian influence. So he sees basically his role as somebody at the service of a restored counter-revolutionary monarch, compatible with also the priorities of the British Empire in the Mediterranean. In 1827, Richard Church suddenly accepts the invitation of the London Greek Committee to become the leader of the Greek Revolutionary Army. In what seems at first sight as an extraordinary change in career, he moves from being the defender of the values of counter-revolution into a revolutionary himself. He will have, in fact, to abandon the uniform of the Neapolitan army as the king demands him to do so, and he will, however, justify his decision to go to Greece on the basis of his commitment to the defense of Christianity and the Christian population against Ottoman despotism. So what are the values of Richard Church's Philhellenism? Well, a contempt for Turkish despotism and also a support for the interest of the British Empire and a determination to civilize the Mediterranean populations. So these are the sort of the core values of Richard Church's Philhellenism, which in fact are, in spite of what seems to be an incredible change in career, in continuity with the previous part of his own military involvement in the Mediterranean. So Church is very much a figure like Napier that Sakis Gekas discussed yesterday in his wonderful paper. He's somebody who is not interested in introducing constitutional freedoms in the Mediterranean. He's somebody who has no desire, who thinks that the only role that the British have is to defend their interests and to civilize from above uncivilized populations. But while Napier is concerned about education, schools, Richard Church has no interest in it. He thinks that the only way to civilize the Greeks is through the war. It's a civilizing tool, the war, and that's, if you read his sort of multi-volume history of the war that is leading in Greece, that's his main concern, is to enforce regular fighting in the war against the Ottomans and to make sure that the war becomes civilized, that the Greek fighters are not brutal against the Muslims, and also that the phenomenon of brigandage is repressed. There's nothing beyond this in his commitment to the Greek War of Independence, besides also keeping into consideration the priorities and interests of the British government when in 1827 he decides to support the election of Capodistrias. He does so after having a conversation with the governor of the Ionian Islands. And so he acts indirectly as a source of influence, British influence, in the kind of game between the various factions of the Philhellenes and the various parties that divide, the Greek revolutionary leadership. In fact, he accepts the offer to become the leader of the Greek army on the basis the various factions would come to an agreement and unify themselves. So how do we contextualize then somebody like Richard Church, you know, a counter-revolutionary turned into a revolutionary? Is he unique? Well, I would argue he is not. He belongs to a group of British fighters. Yesterday, Sakis mentioned a few of them. He actually mentioned Robert Wilson, that you, Anna, mentioned also in your paper. While Robert Wilson had also fought like Richard Church against the French for the British Empire in the Napoleonic period. He was a radical. He was a supporting of constitutional reform in Britain. He also was a supporter of the Constitution of Spain, and he continued to fight as a volunteer in Spain in 1823 when there was a French invasion, and he went to Cadiz to lead a group of volunteers to defend the constitutional regime of Spain. So he was a very different brand of British volunteer. So I would argue that Church is much closer as a type of British officer to Lord Sir William Beresford, who was the leader of the British army in Portugal during the Napoleonic Wars, and actually he became de facto the ruler of Portugal, along with the Board of Governors representing the King of Portugal, who was exiled in Brazil between 1815 and 1820, when basically he's in control of Portugal. Portugal is formally an independent country, but via Beresford, England exerts an enormous amount of influence over Portugal. And significantly in 1820, the revolution in Portugal breaks out with an act of keeping Beresford out of Portugal, kicking out the British officers. In the same way that in Palermo, the revolution starts with expelling Church. It's quite symbolic. Get rid of these British officers. I will stop there and move quickly to the second character that I discovered when studying the revolution in Palermo. And this is a character about whom we know absolutely nothing, apart from this extraordinary petition written in Italian that I discovered in the archive of Palermo by Emanuele Scordili, who was an officer a Christian officer from Crete, who had lost his job as a member of the Albanian regiment for the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And in 1820, he petitions the revolutionary Sicilian government saying, I want to offer my services as an interpreter because I speak Russian, Turkish language, as well as Italian. This petition is written in Italian, and I translate here in English parts of it. And he says, I want to work for you, Sicilian government, because the Greeks and Sicilians have been and still are one single nation. And moreover, my residence in Sicily for almost 20 years has made me a veritable Sicilian. What does it mean? What does this mobility tell us about the Age of Revolution? What does it mean that he thinks that the Greeks and Sicilians belong to a single nation? What is the nation in this text? Well, in 1820, it could mean different things. It could have been the nation of the Spanish Constitution that is introduced in Palermo, that is the sovereign nation that declares the people as sovereign, a people that can elect a government. But I would probably argue that this is not the case in this petition. There's no reference to the Constitution. It could have simply been the state. Up to the beginning of the 19th century, La Nazione Siciliana is the dual Sicilian state. With Nazione, you refer to a state. With Sicily, you could refer to Sicily alone as an island, or to the whole of the kingdom covering Naples as well. This was also ambiguous, although in 1820 it becomes only Sicily because the independence is declared. But it could also be something different. Again, it could be the Nazione as the community of Greeks in Palermo, simply. Because another context to understand this text is that Scordili belonged to the Orthodox community of Palermo that could have been called Nazione Siciliana. So to understand this text and the meaning of these words, we need to look at the context to which this document or the life of Scordili belong. He belongs to a type of Orthodox mercenary that, as we've heard from Lucien Frary earlier on, had been at the service of the Russians since Catherine the Great, and Scordili had been also working for the Russian imperial fleet 30 years before. That's what he says in this petition. And later for the regiment of the Albanian regiment of the Bourbon to Sicily, a type of regiment that had existed in Naples since the 16th century at least. But he also belonged to the Greek nation, the La Nazione Greca. They had a church in Palermo. So nazione here could mean different things, and we really do not know what it meant. Also, to say that Sicily and Greece are one nation, is this a kind of revolutionary internationalism, or is it a kind of early modern notion of identity? It could really be both. Certainly in this moment, the identities of the Greek diaspora in the Mediterranean is shifting, and we find members of the Greek diaspora in Mallorca, in Spain, who are more explicitly taking on the language of the constitutional patriotism of Spain. Nicolas Francopoulou and Yanni Papadopoulou published a letter in a constitutional journal published in Spain, saying that they want to become members of a patriotic society, and they think that Spain should lead the regeneration of Greece in the name of the values of the constitutional government. So here you have Greeks who are embracing a new language as well in the 1820s. Now, of course, what I think was interesting for me about this petition and this article is that they were published or written between May and August 1820. And so the following year, people like Papadopoulou or Scordili may well have gone to fight in the Greek Revolution. We don't know. Scordili is not in the list of Greeks buried in the cemetery in Palermo. So it's a good guess that he may have gone to fight in Greece in the following year. But the point I want to make here that already before the Greek Revolution, identities among the Greeks in the Mediterranean were shifting in different ways in a moment where identities, multiple identities sort of coexisted with older and newer meaning attached to the notion of patria and nazione. Finally, the third character is a Sicilian. So far, I've spoken about the revolution in Palermo. I have not mentioned really somebody whose surname was explicitly Sicilian. And here we have Andrea Mangiaruva, a Carbonaro, a member of the secret society who, when the Sicilian Revolution is crushed in 1821, he organizes a second conspiracy that is discovered by the Bourbon police, so he has to flee Sicily. He goes to Malta, from Malta to Gibraltar, and he goes to fight to Cadiz in 1823, where he joins Sir Robert Wilson, this British liberal pro-constitutional officer, to defend the constitutional government of Spain. When they are defeated, he goes to Portugal, where he settles, and he joins the community of artisans making and selling sort of turtle shell boxes to the royal family. So again, what is interesting to me about the biography of Mangiaruva is that, like Scordili, he belongs to a type of trans-Mediterranean sort of migrant that is much older than that of the post-Napoleonic era, in the same way that Scordili is in the line of a tradition of Mediterranean mercenaries. Mangiaruva belongs to a tradition of migration that connected Sicily and southern Italy to Portugal, where lots of artisans settled from the 18th century onwards into the 19th century. I come to my conclusions. I'm running late, Anna, I know. So certainly the Napoleonic era was a transformational moment in terms of the mobilities that took place in the Mediterranean. But I think it is important for us historians of the 19th century, it's a critique that I apply to myself as a historian of the 19th century, to look at things in the long durée, that there existed earlier mobilities that we need to take into account. Not everything starts from scratch in the 19th century. And this means that if we look at trajectories and mobilities, but also identities and languages, this means that there is a kind of plurality and variety of them that coexist in a moment of transition and flux. So there is a coexistence of multiple temporalities and no linear trajectories from the pre-revolutionary to the revolutionary era that applies to the meaning of nazione, nation, for sure. But these cases show that Philhellenism was certainly not necessarily, as we learned already yesterday, a movement for the emancipation on the basis of notions of popular sovereignty, of constitutional rights, that in fact we need to go beyond the binary of revolution and counter-revolution. Very often the two things were connected or blurred. And we also need to think about volunteers and Philhellenes as well, also as mercenaries and economic migrants. These categories are also overlapping. And so Philhellenism, if we take as a starting point, Palermo in 1820 is only one of the many possible Mediterranean mobilities of the 1820s that could be based on different motivations and justifications that may or may not have to do with constitutional liberties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we continue with our last speaker, Maria-Christina Chatziioannou, who is a historian. She has taught graduate and undergraduate courses at the University of Athens, Crete, and the École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales in Paris. She has published on social and economic history of the 18th to the 20th century, merchant houses and entrepreneurs, commercial networks, retailing, sovereign debt, and Italian Risorgimento. Please.
Thank you. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ για την πρόσκληση συμμετοχής σε αυτό το συνέδριο. And I will continue in English. So this is a paper about historiography. Historiography has well described and defined the various national Philhellenisms, German, French, Swiss, or British. These classifications mainly correspond to linguistic restrictions, political conditions, and different social and economic environments. The English and French corporate Philhellenism moved between philanthropy and politics. Supporters of the Greek cause were part of the world of salons and secularism. The form of action, concerts, celebrations, dances, fundraisers, painting exhibitions, theatrical performances, and the spaces that the Philhellenists chose to organize charitable activities, churches, theaters, salons, were characteristics of the growing bourgeois society. British Philhellenism is well defined across the London Greek Committee of 1823. Among its many protagonists were Edward Blaquier, Leicester Stanhope, and Lord Byron, with his unique personal network and public appeal. So, Italian volunteers and refugees from failed revolutions in the Italian peninsula passed a period of their life or lost it in Greek battlefields. Peta, Neokastro, Haidari, Acropolis of Athens, or served the newly formed Greek administration. Along the British Philhellenes, a number of people of Italian origin crossed their paths, creating transnational encounters such as Giacinto Provana di Collegno, Antonio Morandi, Allerino Palma di Cesnola, Giuseppe Pecchio, and Sartori di Santa Rosa, all sustaining a heritage related to the Napoleonic formation of the nation-state model in Europe. The bicentenary of the Greek Revolution of 1821-2021 gave us the opportunity to re-evaluate post-Napoleonic Europe and Philhellenism. The Greek War of Independence and the subsequent creation of the Greek state met the Napoleonic world within the special context of Italian and Greek territories. The Napoleonic era offered a new compact and homogeneous space in terms of laws and institutions in parts of Italy and in the Ionian Islands for a period 1807-1814, offering opportunities and tools for modernization within a contemporary world. The abolition of archaic land tenure bonds that blocked the mobility of land ownership, the introduction of new legal codes, the rationalization of public administration, and the promotion of higher education are some of the Napoleonic legacies during a short but intense period of influencing the mentality of social groups in both Italian and Ionian regions. By offering opportunities for social ascent, as well as by cultivating skills and abolishing internal borders and customs, the Napoleonic system offered an array of opportunities for the nascent and dynamic Italian and Ionian bourgeoisie. It is within this context that we should evaluate the thousands of officers who experienced military life and offered services to the Napoleonic army and administration. The most numerous of all were the military men, the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Many of them that headed for Greece had fought for Napoleon. Historiography has re-examined the role of the post-Napoleonic era in the context of a common background through various examples that focus on geographical expansion and the role of military men forming exile networks in Greek lands after 1821 and 1831. The importance within a wider Ionian Italian area of Andreas Calvos, Dionysios Solomos, and Ugo Foscolo, literati from Zante, with fluid hybrid identities has been well studied. So after 2000, historical research set new historiographical directions, redefining Italian Philhellenism from the viewpoint of philological, linguistic, artistic interactions to transnational networks of friendship, political cooperation, and cultural encounters. Italian Philhellenism, I think, offers two prolific historiographical pathways. On the one hand, the narrative of the Italian refugees in the Ionian Islands and the Greek state, with the formation of transnational networks, and on the other, cultural Philhellenism transmitted through poems, prose, translations, and theatrical plays. Both aspects are defined by geographical proximity with the Adriatic Sea being a major decisive factor. Moreover, early 19th century British milieu has been at the spotlight of the production of new political and economic ideas, and London, a hub of Italian political exiles in the 1820s, became a crucial node in the formation of new networks. So a new field of international cooperation, since the 1820s were contracts of foreign state loans in the City of London, both in terms of agreements and negotiations, as well as stocks and bonds that circulated in the early European financial markets. An indispensable prerequisite for contracting these sovereign loans was a national state and government. This new economic reality determined the internationalization of the foreign debts of European countries through contracting sovereign loans and the circulation of the corresponding bonds, shares in the British, French, and Dutch financial markets. Many of the Italian expatriates that passed to Greece via London were involved in the finances of the Greek War of Independence. Therefore, this is an ongoing project regarding Italian Philhellenism and its historiography. Now, Italian Philhellenism forms explicitly or ramblingly the nucleus of various historiographical parallelisms between Greece and Italy in the 19th and 20th centuries, based on the idea of the historical mission of the two countries, and here I mainly refer to the work of Antonis Liakos. And this is the main differentiation with the other nationally defined Philhellenisms. My first point is that beyond the ancient Greek and Roman cooperation and rivalry, which was and still is a major field of research, Byzantium and its legacy stands out as a shared ground of research in the post-war period. In addition to this, we can re-evaluate the important role of the relevant academic discourses with the emblematic presence of Greek and Italian professors of literature and their intellectual heritage. Their importance was based on the historical edition of literary sources and the political circumstances of World War II that led to the Italian belligerent invasion to Greece in 1940. I will focus here on this idiosyncratic relation. A significant number of studies was produced by eminent scholars who shaped Greek-Italian studies. Bruno Lavanini, Vincenzo Rotolo in Sicily, Giorgio Zoras in Rome and Athens, during the post-war period. I will refer here to these scholars, university professors who influenced pre-war and post-war Greek-Italian studies, Italian Philhellenism included. Bruno Lavanini and Giorgio Zoras, they were of the same age almost. The latter was half Italian by birth and had studied law in Italy. Zoras was professor of Greek literature and before the war and later continued his courses in Greek language and literature for a period 1956 to 1968 in Rome and from 1942 to 1979 in Athens. During his pre-war professorship, he introduced 44 doctoral theses and in the following period 1957 to 1979, more than 30. His personal research comprised more than 500 publications. In a different direction from Giorgio Zoras stands another Greek with close ties with Italy, but without relevant academic qualifications, whose work remained underestimated for a long time. Kostas Kerofilas, 1881-1961, was born in Zakynthos and conducted historical research in Italian archives from 1905 to 1914, a period in which he lived in Rome as a journalist. He had published many articles in various journals, maintaining close relations with Ionian Islands, establishing himself as a point of reference for Italian Greek literature and international political relations. Kostas Kerofilas published the first historical account of on Greece and Italy during the Italian Risorgimento. Both Zoras and Lavanini praised the importance of Byzantium in accordance with interpretative scheme of the historical continuity of the Greek nation, described mainly by Konstantinos Paparigopoulos in his History of the Hellenic Nation from the Ancient Times to the Present. So my research hypothesis is that the outline of Italian Philhellenic literature was affected mostly by these two academics and their students. In the post-war years, both tried to mend the broken cultural ties between Greece and Italy because of Italy's belligerence towards Greece. So 8 years after the Italian invasion of 1940 in Greece, an important researcher of Byzantine law, professor of civil law and politician, gave the celebratory speech in the Academy of Athens, Konstantinos Triantafylopoulos. This speech began from the glorious ancient Greek past and ended up criticizing the Italian state fascist ideology. Despite historical ambiguities, the quest for liberty had united the two nations, and it was the right time in 1948 to commemorate the role of, I quote, Italian refugees, Santa Rosa's and Frati's sacrifice. Hence, it was the heroic war of the Greek independence that inspired Italian Risorgimento, and it was a crucial point of reconciliation for Greece and Italy at that time. This was effectuated mainly in the universities of Palermo and Rome and in the Italian Cultural Institute in Athens. It was an interpretation of Italian Philhellenic literature adopted in a phase of Traditionbildung, starting with a study of the Byzantine scholars that fled to Italy after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So, in the post-war period, the Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and post-Byzantine Studies was founded in 1951 in Venice, located in the historical Flagini College building. It was the outcome of a cultural agreement between Greece and Italy in 1954, which provided for the founding of a scientific institute in Venice, and on the other hand, the reopening of the Italian School of Archaeology and the Istituto Italiano di Cultura di Atene, which had closed during the Second World War. The building of Istituto Italiano di Cultura di Atene in 1944 was the base of the Italian Embassy of the Republic of Salò. In the following years, it was confiscated by the Greek government and returned to Italy, becoming the headquarters of the Italian Cultural Institute in 1954, the year in which the cultural agreement between the two countries was signed. Its first director was Bruno Lavanini for the period 1952-1959. In 1952, after Lavanini's initiative, a committee undertook the task to create in Palermo the Istituto Siciliano di Studi Bizantini. Lavanini's contribution to the rewarming of post-war Greek-Italian cultural bonds was also praised by Professor Manouchos Manouchakas, director of the Institute of the Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies in Venice for the period 1966-1982. Lavanini's first visit in Greece was in 1921 with a scholarship in the Italian Archaeological School in Athens. He was soon well acquainted with the classical world and became a strong philologist in Byzantine and Neo-Hellenic studies, bringing forth many new students who continued to work on the same philological lines. Lavanini didn't publish on Philhellenism Telkel, except one small article. He was a Philhellenist himself who carved Greek-Italian cultural bonds and the relevant studies. In 1961, the Department of Italian Language and Literature was established in the University of Thessaloniki. The Greek-Latin civilization continued to be a key historiographical topic concerning the relations between the two countries, and in a similar context, the legacy of Byzantium in the Italian peninsula and Neo-Hellenic literature. The study of the Italian Risorgimento, Italian Philhellenism, were still in the margins of historical research. Even though Philhellenic studies were published in the first half of the 20th century, the shadow of the Italian fascist regime in 1922, 1943, and the war between the two countries were more decisive than we could have imagined in coining Italo-Greek and Philhellenic relations and historiographical production. The formation of the aforementioned institutions in the post-war period were the decisive structures that enabled Italian and Greek agency to restructure these relations and enabled the historiographical production on Greek-Italian relations and Italian Philhellenism to find slowly its place. Thank you.